In the shadowy aftermath of the Beatles' breakup, a musical rivalry was brewing that would challenge the foundations of 1970s rock idealism. Steely Dan, the sardonic duo of Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, was about to unleash a sonic takedown that would expose the disconnect between celebrity activism and street-level reality. Their target, none other than John Lennon, the self-proclaimed smart Beatle, whose utopian anthem Imagine had captured the world's imagination. But beneath the song's ethereal melody lurked a message that Steely Dan found not just naive, but dangerously out of touch. Set against a New York City landscape of economic collapse, rising crime, and shattered post-60s dreams, Steely Dan crafted a musical response so cutting, so meticulously designed to mock Lennon's idealism that it became a defining statement of cultural disillusionment. The rise of Steely Dan in the post-Beatles era.
We never came up with a band of our own that we felt was the right combination of guys, that it was stable. It was just me and Walter. You hear somebody in a record and you say, wow, listen to this guy's a great soloist, let's have him come in and, what would he be good on? What would suit his style? That's the fun.
In 1971, as the dust was still settling from the Beatles' seismic breakup, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker came together to form Steely Dan. Like many bands of their generation, they grew up under the long shadow cast by the Fab Four. The Beatles had left an indelible mark on the musical landscape, and new groups were often measured against their towering legacy. Steely Dan, however, was not content to simply imitate their predecessors. While they admired the Beatles' approach to music making, particularly their decision to focus on studio work rather than touring, Fagen and Becker had their own unique vision. They set out to create what they called special material, a sophisticated blend of rock and jazz that set them apart from their contemporaries. Initially, the band was forced to pay their dues by writing bubblegum pop tunes for artists like Tommy Roe and the Grassroots. But as they honed their craft, they began to develop a sound all their own. Fagen's panic disorder made it difficult for him to front the group in live settings, and financial constraints made extensive touring unfeasible. But these challenges proved a blessing in disguise. Taking a cue from the Beatles' later years, Steely Dan decided to make the recording studio their home. This decision allowed them to perfect their intricate arrangements and complex harmonies, relying on a rotating cast of talented session musicians to bring their vision to life. As Fagen explained in a 1995 interview with Mojo magazine, quote, "The Beatles had not long before set the example of concentrating on records and not touring, and we were arrogant enough to follow their example." The decision paid off. Steely Dan's jazz-infused rock sound began to attract a devoted following, including some high-profile admirers. Even Paul McCartney, a former Beatle himself, became a fan of their work. But as Steely Dan's star rose, they found themselves increasingly at odds with the idealistic message being put forth by another ex-Beatle, John Lennon. John Lennon's post-Beatles activism and Imagine.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us.
As Steely Dan was finding its footing in the early 70s, Lennon was embarking on a new phase of his career, one that saw him become as famous for his activism as for his music. Following the Beatles' breakup, Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, threw themselves into the peace movement, staging headline-grabbing events like their famous Bed-Ins for Peace. In 1971, Lennon released what became his most iconic solo work, Imagine. The song, with its simple melody and utopian lyrics, quickly became an anthem for the peace movement. Lennon envisioned a world without countries, possessions, or religion. The type of place where people could live in harmony, free from the divisions that plagued society. Imagine was more than just a song, it was a manifesto. Lennon took every opportunity to spread his message of peace and love, appearing on talk shows and giving interviews where he expounded on his vision for a better world. He saw himself as a voice for change, using his platform as a former Beatle to reach millions with his idealistic message. But Lennon's activism was taking place against a backdrop of increasing social and economic turmoil. In New York City, where Lennon had made his home, the early 70s were a time of crisis. The city was losing manufacturing jobs at an alarming rate, crime was on the rise, and drug use was becoming increasingly prevalent. Between 1969 and 74, New York lost 500,000 manufacturing jobs. 1 million homes depended on welfare, and the murder rate hit a staggering high. It wasn't just New York facing challenges. The Vietnam War was intensifying. The Manson family murders had shaken the nation's sense of security, and income inequality was beginning to widen. The optimism of the 1960s was giving way to a harsher, more cynical worldview. In this context, Lennon's calls for peace and his vision of a world without possessions began to strike some as naive at best and out of touch at worst. While many still found hope and inspiration in his message, others saw a disconnect between Lennon's idealism and the harsh reality of life for ordinary people. Steely Dan's response: only a fool would say that. In 1972, Steely Dan released their debut album, Can't Buy a Thrill. Among its tracks was a song called Only a Fool Would Say That, a direct response to John Lennon's Imagine and his ongoing peace activism. The song, with its upbeat bossa nova groove and seemingly cheerful melody, masked a biting critique of Lennon's idealistic worldview. From the opening lines, Steely Dan takes aim at Lennon's vision. Quote, "Our world become one of salads and sun, only a fool would say that." The song paints a picture of Lennon as an out-of-touch celebrity, contrasting his lofty ideals with the harsh realities faced by ordinary people. The lyrics go on to describe, quote, "A boy with a plan, a natural man, wearing a white Stetson hat," a thinly veiled reference to Lennon, who was often seen wearing a white hat during this period. This image of Lennon as a naive dreamer is juxtaposed against the man in the street who doesn't have the luxury of believing in utopian ideals. Fagen and Becker's critique is particularly pointed when they sing, "You do his 9 to 5, drag yourself home half alive, and there on the screen, a man with a dream." This verse encapsulates the disconnect between Lennon's idealism and the daily struggles of working-class people. The song's message is clear. Lennon's call to imagine no possessions rings hollow to those who have little to begin with. Steely Dan suggests that it's easy for a wealthy rock star to preach about abandoning materialism. But for those struggling to get by, such ideas are at best unrealistic and at worst insulting. Only a Fool Would Say That marked a shift in the cultural conversation. It signaled the end of the wide-eyed optimism of the 1960s and the beginning of a more cynical, pragmatic era. Steely Dan was not alone in this critique. Other artists, including Frank Zappa and Paul Simon, also expressed skepticism about Lennon's approach to activism. The song's impact went beyond its critique of Lennon. It established Steely Dan as a band unafraid to challenge the status quo and even take on the biggest names in music. Their willingness to mock a former Beatle demonstrated a level of confidence and irreverence that went on to define their career. Steely Dan's Only a Fool Would Say That stands as a pivotal moment in rock history, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. It challenged the idealism of John Lennon and signaled a new, more cynical approach to music and culture. Now it's time to hear from you. What's your favorite Steely Dan song? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.